Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. We're back for the final round of the Booktube prize. So this is a community-run prize for books that have gained some popularity on Booktube primarily, that we think the community will think are our best books that came out in the past year. And I am judging in nonfiction this year. And so I've actually judged the semifinal round, and 3 of my books moved forward into the final, so I've already read those and I'm not going to be rereading those. But I've got 3 additional books now to read by the end of September. And I'm very excited about them because commonly the nonfiction is very strong in the final round and I rarely have duds. So I am here to check in with you because I have finished my first book and the chunkiest, and that is Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. This is a very well-known author, though I haven't read his previous book, Midnight in Chernobyl. But I have to say, on the strength of this book, I definitely want to. This was so compelling and just truly fantastic journalism and history. So if you're not familiar, Challenger was part of the US space program, and it was the first flight that was intended to carry a civilian, a teacher, Krista McAuliffe, into space. And there was very much a ramp up in that space program, turning from emerging science into something that they were seeing as more day-to-day and the potential for space tourism as an avenue for US progress. So this was so compelling to read because it is more of a comprehensive history than just a minute focused forensics of the disaster itself. And giving us that scope and context helped so much to understand the disaster in more depth. So we're starting with the beginnings of the space program, really. And we're getting the building of NASA initially. We then move into an area of like the hiring and the progress really in NASA in hiring astronauts and recruiting as they were trying to diversify, and the barriers to that in the times of the early space program in the 60s and 70s even, because there was a drive toward diversification and pulling in people of different races and genders, and there were a lot of barriers and conflicts surrounding that. So I actually really love the historical sci-fi series, the Lady Astronaut series by Mary Robinette Kowal, and I always knew that was kind of based on history, but I didn't realize how genuinely close to real history it was until reading this. And I really want to dive into that subject more, I think, because of just how fascinating that aspect was. The involvement of these people who had lots of skills and expertise that were both being included and welcomed in some areas and also shut out in other areas was just very, very fascinating. So from there, we start building into the actual disaster. The lead up is extremely tense, and you are seeing over a period of years these failings at pretty much every level. And ironically, it kind of gave me work-related PTSD. For those who don't know or are watching this later, I just recently have left my job, and so many of the elements were really ringing true to my own experience in a big corporation. Testing that's just skipped to cut time, to turn around cycles faster, management decisions that are at odds with engineers and experts, just thing after thing that I felt so familiar to. So that was really hard reading and kept me very anxious as things were going along, because I could see where it was going, and obviously I knew what was going to happen. And it culminates in this extreme conversation the night before the disaster, where they're trying to raise red flags, the engineers are, and people are not listening. And so this was very, very preventable, and just how preventable it was more shocking to me, I think, having read this than I expected. But then it turns into the after effects, the trials and hearings in Congress that were held to come up with, well, both in the public sector in NASA and the private sector in the contractors, where does fault lie? And the uncovering of things that were hidden was so compelling, it turned into almost a courtroom drama in the back half. So this was just a fantastic sort of almost true crime in the back half, where I feel like we were provided with so much buildup, and as we went along, it expressed it so thoroughly and well that there wasn't really any dead air in this book, despite its length. The whole thing contained great information that kept me reading. So I found this very unputdownable, and I would most compare this to Paradise Falls, that for me sort of came out of nowhere, I think last year or the year before, and was a similar case where it was very human stories, where we get a lot about the individual astronauts and their backgrounds, but also we get this buildup of a wider community and national story across this book of wrongdoing at many levels. And so I thought this was just incredible, and I can see why it's made it to the final. I think I'm gonna say that about every book though. So I'm gonna have a struggle ranking my 6 books, I think. But I think that is where I will leave it with this one, because pure gush, I absolutely loved it. I would hand this to just about anybody and think they would probably enjoy it. I will say a note on the audio. The audio was fine, it was usable, but I found for my own liking, the audiobook narration was a little bit one tone. It didn't have enough variance in speech pattern. And so it was usable, but it was not a standout. I really wish it had a different audiobook narration, unfortunately. So yeah, note on the audio. I think this is the only one that's available to me on audio, and I did hybrid read it, so the others will be physically read. So onward to whenever I check in next with my next book. So, book 2, The Siege by Bennett McIntyre, a 6-day hostage crisis and the daring special forces operation that shocked the world, is done. And as always, Booktube Prize is exposing me to new things and giving me new information, pulling in books I really would have never turned to. I doubt I would have ever picked this up, but this was a great book. Yet another one. I have no doubts, usually, at this point in the nonfiction round at least. Everything's going to be good in the final. So this one felt very like someone trying to write a nonfiction thriller, because it's told day by day. It's very chronological, action-packed, very tense. I mean, it's a hostage situation, so obviously. But it's also really interesting because this is happening in a time of great change. And so a lot of firsts happen here. So what this book is about is the 6-day hostage crisis at the Iranian embassy in England. But it was in response to a much longer running hostage crisis in Iran at the embassy there. And that was surrounding a time of massive political change and upheaval in Iran. And I don't know enough history about that to really comment on the sort of Iranian politics. But what you clearly take away from this story is that these were unlikely hostage takers that were reacting out of that sort of political situation in desperation. And so they were jumping into this mostly as sort of peaceable people who didn't want to do this. And that's very strong as a thread through this book, is that they were really reluctant hostage takers. But they felt they didn't have a choice, and their main demand, among a few others, was the release of hostages in Iran. And so I feel like over the 6 days, it is so tense, and you get a connection with both sides. You watch the hostages and hostage takers form bonds and connections and recognize the reasons why this is happening a bit, while still being completely fearful for their lives. But over those 6 days, their deadlines keep slipping. And so you begin to doubt and wonder, are they really serious about this? And as it progresses along, you continue to see the military effort building up to the counter. So where that is increasingly a threat, where you're feeling less and less threat really from the hostage takers. So it really just maintains the tension incredibly, incredibly well. And back to what I was saying about there being a number of firsts, this is so interesting because it is encapsulating that in the telling here, where so much about technology was really advancing. This was in 1980, so we were definitely not anywhere close to where we are today. And there were still things like moments where the two sides outside and inside the building are communicating by just them opening a window and talking to each other out of it to try and communicate between the outside police and military and the hostage demands. Like, if that happened today, people would be knocked out, I'm sure. So, along with that, this was a first in terms of the media coverage, where not only was there sort of media connections in the embassy, because it was the embassy, there were people there covering things who had media connections that were then inside as hostages. But there's also this aspect of the first live streaming of something like this from media outside, and that going out and being beamed into people's homes live as it's happening and taking over. And there's a whole thread of this, that there was this massive, like, a snooker championship, which is like pool, I guess. I don't know. I'm not overly familiar with snooker, but so that was going on, and it got co-opted because of the coverage of this, and people were upset about that, but nobody really cared that it was off the air, and nobody noticed because this was just such a unusual, first of its kind type of situation. And thinking about how things happen today when we have like school lockdowns and stuff, that kind of thing, we see that something similar very commonly now. So thinking and contrasting that was how far we've come to today was really interesting. I think that so much of this was a story I hadn't heard before. And so learning about why this was happening, about the situation, both during the hostage story and the reasons they were doing it, was really new information to me. I do kind of wish there had been a lot more built in about the progression toward that Iranian hostage situation, because that doesn't feel like it was really present. There's a little bit of context to it, but very, very little. This is mainly focused on taking us through chronologically through the actual hostage situation day by day. So I don't know, without making conclusions about what I think on the situation, I did overwhelmingly come out feeling like I maybe wasn't on the same page as the author. I don't know, because there was sort of this whole storyline that the hostage takers were really pretty against violence, and they really didn't want to be doing this. And that only kept getting stronger. And yet, as the military got involved, I kept feeling like they were escalating things and were, well, as it wound up, I felt like things were utterly bungled. And yet the people in the book are saying, oh yeah, great job, you did awesome, in the end. And I felt like it was botched so badly in the way that it's told. So I don't know if I'm supposed to be taking that as the here's what actually happened versus here's how people reacted to it in the time, or if that's the narrative. I'm getting into rambling now, and I need to not do that, or this is going to be super long. So I think the one other thing I will mention about this is maybe a personal taste note. That's how I've treated it in the past versus a real critique of the book. But I do want to read on the sources here. So the author has a note at the back about sourcing of information for this. Memories are malleable and fallible. Few events in modern British history are so heavily mythologized and misunderstood as the Iranian embassy siege. Over the intervening years, many people have recounted or added to the story without being directly or even peripherally involved. As one SAS officer warned me when I was setting out on this project, if everyone who claimed to be there at the time had really been there, the balcony would have collapsed under the weight. Some of the resulting legends, burnished by repetition, have proved extremely durable. For example, several eyewitnesses assured me with absolute conviction that one of the gunmen was killed by a single sniper shot fired from Hyde Park. This did not happen. 2 or more people can witness the same event but retain entirely different or contradictory recollections. After 4 decades, our memories become true to ourselves when they may in fact be inaccurate. We come to believe we have seen something we have only heard about. One of the challenges of this book has been to sift through the huge amount of remembered material, identifying those memories that seem to me most credible, consistent, and in agreement with other verified evidence. This means privileging some memories over others. So he goes on to just generally talk about the access that he had to information. There are a lot of good reasons for him for there to be good records. There were people who were taking notes that were hostages. So there are reasons to have a pretty decent record, and a lot of stuff to draw on. However, a huge portion of this is told in dialogue. It kept being dialogue over and over and over throughout the book. And I was baffled by that choice as an authorial decision to tell this in quotes. For me, I'm very, very against having that in nonfiction unless it is something that there is a record of verbatim and you can verify word for word. So something in writing or audio recording. And this would not be that. So why would you lean on a huge portion of your book being quoted dialogue if you can't verify those quotes is a question for me. I don't know if I would take points off of judging this book for that, because I think he probably was attempting to get the gist of the conversation and had reasons to be able to verify that with multiple sources, probably. But why would you put it in quotes? I don't know if I can get over that because it bothers me so much in nonfiction. Like, you can't do that as far as I'm concerned. So that's gonna stick in the back of my mind as I'm ranking, I'm sure. So anyway, onward to my final book for the Booktube Prize final round, Slow Noodles. I finished book 3, my final book for the Booktube Prize, and Slow Noodles by Chantha Nwang was yet another absolute banger. These are all hits. So my job of ranking is going to be very, very hard. So for now, let's just talk about the book. So Slow Noodles is a memoir. Very unusual for memoirs to make it to the final because it is such a individual personal story, and yet this one is great, so I can see also why. It's not quite a biography, but it is told chronologically, more or less, and is quite expansive, starting in very young childhood. So Chantha is growing up in Cambodia as this child in a somewhat privileged family, and initially she doesn't really recognize that, but a lot of that privilege you see through food, really. It's her having the money to go buy snacks that she then soon after realizes were an entire family's food budget in her community. Things like that increasingly become clear to her that she has this somewhat affluent life. And then things dramatically change for her when Pol Pot is taking power, and a whole societal change is being processed in childhood through food in a way. And that's why Slow Noodles comes up here. But it's not all positive food experiences. A lot of this is living through not having enough food, in experiencing rationing or the types of food that they're getting through rationing being undesirable or changing in ways that are undesirable, and making things stretch when you don't have anything. And so some of the recipes are a bit tongue-in-cheek, but there are recipes throughout this book as well for the foods that were familiar to Chantha. And so from childhood, we watch her grow up and live through this great regime change, eventually winding up as a refugee and seeing a whole people sort of decimated by this political regime and the struggles that they went through, where they sort of lost a sense of culture. But it is so interesting to tell that story through food because, and I think that's the strength of this book and the presentation here, is how much there is a connection, not just to how you're getting by and survival day to day, but to our sense of family and our sense of community in how we see the world through food, through cooking, through our access to survive through food. And I think that was integral to this book. There was so much about the refugee experience, especially, that was very, very harrowing. I don't think anything got super graphic or gruesome in this book, but you do get that sense of hopelessness, I think, through all of this. She spent years, I think a decade, in refugee status, in camps, not having basically a home to call her own. And so that sense of people losing sight of the ability to have anything, desperately trying, and there just being no path forward, really comes across here. So I think that was very hard to read. But also, this is such a hopeful story because she does wind up getting out of that and finding some hope, finding the ability to create a women's skills center in the end, that where she is enriching herself and others. And that creativity, that drive to build something, the power of the human spirit, I think, comes through in all of that, to continue on and persist through that hopelessness. And food connects a lot to that. So I think that's the strength. And this was just so impeccably told in getting that across and telling that story. I think for me, the one thing that I wanted more from, and this is such a personal, individual story that I can understand it being a memoir. It sticks to that. I wanted the broader scope. I don't know a ton about Cambodia history or anything about this regime change politically, other than I'm aware that it happened. And I wish we had gotten the broader political story of what was happening. And other than very brief mentions, it's really not covered here. So to the previous books that I was talking about, I mean, like look at Challenger, there was a big section on talking about the diversification and sort of hiring and training that was going on from the beginning to disaster time. And that sounds like it would be unrelated, right? But it gave me such a depth of understanding and was super relevant in the end to the disaster, in understanding the people, both individual and broader, and working culture of the place where it was happening. And so I feel like for this book, I didn't get as much of that broader context. You're staying very, very much at the individual level. And I felt I missed that. I also felt like there were some points where we're getting her off the cuff comments, and that was fine. But I had to question, like, the self-reflection really was lacking for me in some moments. And that's me being very hypercritical about this. I mean, there was this moment where she is looking back after sort of capitalism has come in and watching what has started, and people trying to make life for themselves and seeing them as very greedy and self-serving, where they're doing things that will sort of enrich them momentarily and not in the long run. And she sees that as them having sort of had a broken spirit as a result of Pol Pot's regime, and doesn't really at any point sort of think about that as an effect of capitalism. And so again, it's a very individual personal response and reaction that's going on there, and we aren't getting any sort of thought about philosophy or wider political aspects, which is fine. Again, for a memoir, I'm definitely not going to factor that in. It was just something that I made note of, where this woman as a perspective, I wanted to sort of get more of her own internalization and processing of things, and I didn't feel I was getting that sort of processing of her own worldview. So anyway, I really, really enjoyed this though. And as I said, there are recipes throughout this. So that was an interesting element. I could totally see, like, obviously they have ingredients that I don't have ready access to because they're not regional or local, but I could see getting access to and making some of these recipes, and that would be an interesting project of its own. So I think that's it for this one. Again, I think this video is going to be overly long because all of these have provided such fodder for thought, for wanting to dive into all of these topics more, which I think is the greatest sign of a very good book in nonfiction, certainly. So I'm not going to rank these right now. I'm going to take this away and do some serious thinking for a couple days before I submit my rankings, because this is going to be a really, really tough one. I have already read 3 of the books, so those will not be talked about in depth here, but if I haven't mentioned it, I will link here my previous semifinal round video doing these similar videos talking about those books. So you can check out Undue Burden, The Barn, and Everyone Who Has Gone Is Here were discussed in that previous video and are still in competition. So they will be included in my final ranking of the 6 books in the final. So anyway, I will check back in shortly with my ranking. All right, for some reason Ripley demanded to help me round out this video with my final ranking. So very quickly, something I didn't mention as I was talking about books, specifically Challenger and also The Siege. Well, that was very short-lived. Rue left his perch, so Ripley had to take off to go chase him away and steal his perch. So you're just to me now. Challenger and The Siege. They have great additive sections of additional material, I guess. So chunks of beautiful glossy photos of people and items surrounding the events. Challenger has a great diagram of the rocket in detail, like very, very detailed. And The Siege has layouts of the whole street the embassy was on, where people would have been, as well as floor by floor diagrams of the entire embassy. So those really are very helpful for reading those books beyond what is provided in other books on the list. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. All right, we are down to ranking my final books here. I have submitted my ranking, so this is finalized, but I don't know who has won, so I have no clue as I'm filming this video. I will make sure to link down below the Booktube Prize video that will have come out by the time you are seeing this, announcing the winner. So you know, but I don't. So this is where I place things. In 6th place, Slow Noodles. As I said in the video discussing the book, it's a memoir. It's extremely good, so I can't really fault it there. But for it to reach the echelon of some of these other books, I needed more in terms of the sort of national and international effects that were leading the course of this individual life in order for it to be at that same level. In 5th place, The Siege. So same case with this one, really. It's so focused in on being kind of a nonfiction thriller. It's even blurbed by McCarran of Slow Horses fame. So it's going for that thriller thing and staying very focused on the moment-by-moment hostage crisis within this building. I feel like I completely missed out on what must have been a much larger story, both coming into the hostage event, the crisis, where there were major political effects leading into it, but surely there were major political effects leading out of it, and none of that's really described in very much detail. In 4th place, The Barn. This one I liked very much, and I think it took a fresh turn and perspective from an author who has personal connections to the events or the location of the barn where Emmett Till was murdered in the 1950s. He was a face of the movement at that time. And so I liked this. I end up liking it, I think, more on reflection over time since I've read it in the semifinal round than I did initially, but still, I feel like it was an odd decision that keeps me from loving it as much as some of these other books to step back from focusing on Emmett Till as much. In 3rd place, Undue Burden. This was so impeccably written. It very much focuses the individual stories and impacts of the downfall of Roe v. Wade in the US, when the Supreme Court kind of struck down that long-held right to bodily autonomy under our constitutional protection for privacy, basically, was that effectively you have a right to medical privacy under that. And it's so focused on personal stories. It's very focused on the chaos caused by unleashing states to decide at will whatever they want that right to be or not to exist. And the chaos that created for what's supposed to be a cohesive nation. I think that, as I said in the original vlog for those 3 books, I don't think it will change anyone's mind, but I think it's an incredible encapsulation of history and very comprehensive feeling. In 2nd place, I have Challenger. And this was a utter page turner. I feel like, counter to those first couple books I mentioned here, I think at every step of the way, this is giving us really in-depth information about the beginnings, the seeds that led to a disaster. And so this is really building those foundational elements and continuing to be an incredibly compelling read along the way. It was almost unputdownable, and it's, I think, the biggest book that I had on my list, or close to, if not. And so it covers this diverse range of topics, though, everything from the very beginnings of the space program to the diversification and social progress affecting that. And then almost a corporate malfeasance, true crimey sort of situation as it is progressing forward, because of sort of turning things into what felt very familiar to me as a corporation that doesn't hold quality as its highest standard. And that, of course, means that in first place, I had Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here. And this was just such a hard-hitting story for me because it was prescient. It is the story for decades of a progression of US interventionism in Central America that has led to an immigrant crisis, as well as the story of 2025 United States relationship with immigrants and the key players that are currently driving that conflict at this point. So it felt like a here's how we got here the whole time I was reading. And I kind of couldn't believe that, but also it makes so much sense and it explains so much of the steps along the way to getting where the United States are currently. So I think this is one of those books that I would, despite its content being really, really difficult, think that everyone should be reading because it is so important in terms of the content included there. So that is my list. First place, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here. I truly hope it wins. So we will see. However, I really won't be disappointed if any of these books win because this was such a strong, impeccable final list. Truly, each of these is a really deserving book that I would tell you you could pick up and read and you will absolutely have a great time reading and get something out of. So that's it for another year of Booktube Prize. I'm both sad and happy because I got some great books out of this, and I'm really looking forward to next year as always. If you are interested in judging for Booktube Prize, keep your eyes out because usually there will be a post on that channel about judging toward the end of the year. So we're heading that way, generally around mid to end of November. The solicitation for judges to sign up for the next year happens. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful weekend reading and in life, and thank you so very much for watching.